Let me tell you a story. It's the true story of what it takes to start a climate business. It's happening to me, and as I record this, we're still just at the beginning. In this episode, a walk in the fields, some bad work news, and a machine called Betty.
We're actually walking now on where we did our very first trial 3 years ago.
And that was just like a strip going all the way through?
And that was pure biochar.
Okay.
So what happened was, where we had very little clover, which is this area, there was no difference. You couldn't see any difference whatsoever. And now it's a patch of clover, massive difference. By the end of September, there's clover everywhere.
I'm Tom, and this is me chatting to a farmer called Mick, standing in a muddy, cold Welsh clover field in a pair of running shoes. I'd driven up there in an electric car and arrived 2 hours late because I ran out of battery. Twice. Yes, range anxiety is a real thing. And by this point, my shoes were soaked through, and I'd made a mental note to pack my wellies if I ever took a day trip to a farm again. So you might be wondering how I ended up here. Let's rewind. This all started more than 3 years ago with another podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show. I'm Tom Praviti.
And I'm Emily Swaddle. Thanks for joining us again, lovely listeners.
In late 2020, I started working with a small team on a podcast about a then relatively unknown climate solution called carbon removal. Carbon removal, also known as CDR, is a series of methods that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. You have more so-called natural forms of carbon removal like reforestation, or more technological methods like direct air capture, which uses fans to filter carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so that you can inject it underground for durable storage. As well as being good for the planet, this removed carbon can then be sold as a credit, helping companies and nations meet their climate goals. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but the first season of the Carbon Removal Show does a great job on breaking down each method. Check it out if you're interested. Anyway, over the course of several months, I got to speak to dozens of people on this subject, and pretty soon after, I was hooked. You see, as a planet, we've agreed to limit temperature increase to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2050. But I learned that even if we flipped a switch today, transitioning to renewables as quickly as we can and rapidly phasing out fossil fuels, there would likely still be enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to nudge us over that 1.5 degree threshold. In short, we also need to remove carbon dioxide. The emphasis of the climate change conversation at the time had rightly been on decarbonisation. But in my mind, not enough people were talking about this other lever we could pull: carbon removal. We needed to do everything, all together, all at once, and with less than 3 decades left to 2050, the clock was ticking. Now, how does this all add up to me standing in a Welsh clover field? Biochar. Biochar as a carbon removal method has fascinated me ever since my co-host Emily told me about it in our first season.
Okay, so we start with biomass. Maybe it's been grown especially for this purpose. Maybe it's a waste product of another process. That biomass is then heated to a really high temperature without oxygen. And this process is called pyrolysis. And it concentrates that carbon that's in the biomass, and you're left with kind of a purer form of carbon in the end.
It's no secret that carbon is everywhere. All living things contain carbon. In fact, plants in particular are so good at drawing carbon dioxide from the air that atmospheric levels measurably decrease during the northern hemisphere's summer, when the majority of the world's landmass is in its growing phase. But essentially, when biomass is left to its own devices, it will eventually decompose, releasing a lot of the carbon it's been storing back into the earth, water, and eventually the air. This is what we call the fast carbon cycle. And thanks to human activity and industrialization, there's more carbon in it than there has been for about 3 million years. However, if you pyrolyze this biomass instead of letting it decompose, you've halted this carbon in its tracks.
So then what am I supposed to do with this lump of biochar? I'm guessing I'm not going to stick it in a barbecue.
No, it's just come from the barbecue. No, we use it, and you're going to love this, Tom, to enhance soil health and carbon storage capacity. Love it.
I'm liking this already.
As the archetypal fairy tale goes, it really was love at first sight, or hearing, or something like that. Regardless, I was mesmerised with all the benefits of biochar, even if I was probably pretty naive about it. The suggestion that adding char to the earth might improve soil health, build climate resilience, and enhance crop yields just blew me away. But I later learned that biochar isn't quite the same as your regular barbecue charcoal, and it's actually being researched for a ton of different uses.
The thing that we commonly say is that biochar is a carbon-rich, charcoal-like material.
Here's Genevieve Hodgins, project manager at the UK's Biochar Demonstrator. The Demonstrator is an all-round authority on biochar application in the UK, so it made sense to pick her brains.
It's very similar to charcoal, but the key difference is that you've got the specific purpose or the specific aim to be storing as much carbon as you can in that material, and then your planned usage of it is not to combust it, not to burn it for energy. Biochar typically is made at a much higher temperature than charcoal because you want to take that carbon that was in your original material and really get rid of anything that might degrade or volatilize off in a short period, and so that you're only left with this really stable carbon in your biochar. Whereas with charcoal, you actually kind of want some of that stuff around so that it can burn, so that you can get all of that energy out of it.
For avoidance of doubt, if anyone's out there making charcoal as a business, they can't just suddenly swap that around and say, oh, actually, no, our charcoal's now biochar, we're going to sell carbon credits.
I think it's very unlikely that you would have a charcoal that met the kind of specifications that you're looking for biochar.
That's really helpful. Could you just give me a flavour of what are the different approaches you can take to kind of utilising the biochar on a farm?
People are looking into applying biochar with other materials. So like mixing biochar with compost, mixing biochar with manure and applying that. People are looking at biochar as an addition to cattle feed to try and reduce gas emissions or methane emissions mostly from cattle. That biochar then does pass through the cow and ends up on the land in its own way as well. We are doing a little bit of work on adding biochar to the composting process. There's potential that it might increase the speed of composting and reduce gas emissions from the composting process. But then people are also looking at applying biochar to areas where you get a lot of runoff. So if you have a lot of, say, nitrogen from your fertilizer runs off into your local watercourses, you get algae blooms. So if you can put biochar in as kind of a filter in certain areas, you might prevent that. So there are loads of different things that can be done with biochar. You can also introduce it to building materials and kind of construction materials, so concrete, but also potentially into asphalt. So there's loads of really interesting stuff going on.
A lot of research is still ongoing, including at the Biochar Demonstrator. But back in 2021, biochar was on the up and was starting to feel like a miracle drug, almost like climate change's penicillin.
Black gold, biochar, and it has all sorts of applications in farming and industry.
Could this charcoal-like material be a solution to limiting carbon emissions and improving soil quality?
What's more, it's actually a modern take on an incredibly ancient technology. Analysis of soils in the Amazon show that indigenous people enhanced their soils with char-like substances as long as 2,500 years ago. Surely they were onto something. My early introduction to biochar had got me thinking, why aren't more people doing this? Why isn't this on every farm, estate and land from here to Timbuktu? Because, as a reminder, as well as these potential benefits being researched, biochar is also, of course, a form of carbon removal, and it's a good one. You see, the more I learned about CDR, the more I discovered that many other approaches had their challenges. Everyone knows we need to plant trees, for example, for all sorts of reasons. But when it comes to its carbon removal efficacy, there are some limitations. It takes up a lot of land, which competes with agriculture, for instance, and there are vast swathes of the earth that are just unsuitable for forestation. It's also not super durable or reliable. Forest fires, diseases, drought are all real risks with these projects, especially in our changing climate. On the other end of the scale, there are approaches like direct air capture. This technology is promising and is being deployed, but it's super expensive and currently only feasible at smaller scales. It's also incredibly technical, and I am not an engineer. But biochar felt like something that I could personally get excited about and could start doing today. It can be made from all sorts of biomass that would otherwise be burned or left to decompose. We already have the technology to make it. Biochar credits are more affordable than a lot of others. In fact, it's considered the cheapest form of durable carbon removal, and it seems to have these additional benefits. In the months and years that followed, the urgency for doing carbon removal and doing more of it became ever more apparent to me. In fact, we went on to dedicate the third season of the Carbon Removal Show to the challenge of scaling up the industry.
As a regular listener to this show, you might be forgiven for thinking that CDR is a booming, megabucks, taking over the world industry. Well, it's not. Not yet.
Have you not got a yacht yet, Emily?
It's in the post. I ordered it.
If we've learned anything over the past few years on this show, it's that we need CDR, and we need it on a much bigger scale than we currently have it. In truth, the numbers were pretty staggering. According to most studies, we were going to need somewhere between 5 to 10 gigatons of carbon removal annually to hit our Paris targets. That's 5 to 10 billion tons. On the one hand, what we were seeing in the CDR space was promising. Major growth in purchases of what we call novel or durable methods, which included biochar. But these were still in the low millions of tons, rather than the billions. What's more,
to date, just 2.8% of novel or durable carbon removal purchased has been delivered. And while the numbers of purchases are a reason to be optimistic, there are plenty of skeptics out there who won't be sold on some of these CDR methods until that carbon is in the ground or wherever it's going.
In other words, just a tiny fraction of the carbon removal that's been paid for has actually happened. Most of it is in the form of what we would call a pre-purchase or an offtake. Kind of like when you pre-order your favourite artist's next album. Actually, that 2.8% stat has ticked up a little since we recorded that episode, but you get the gist. Meanwhile, of those tons that had been delivered, the vast majority, biochar. Biochar was already proving itself in the here and now. I decided I wanted to contribute to the growth of the carbon removal market as opposed to just being a commentator. And that's when I joined a leading CDR marketplace. I was one of the first commercial hires, joining in early 2022. Until then, most carbon removal had been sold direct, so I would have been one of the first people in the world to sell it via a marketplace. While there, something else became very clear to me. Not only did we need carbon removal, but people wanted it. And what's more, demand for CDR and biochar in particular was likely going to increase as companies' net zero targets got closer. But could supply really keep up with this demand? If it was going to, we would need a lot more high quality projects removing that carbon. Fast forward to the summer of 2023, and I started to seriously think about setting up a biochar project. I'd booked an extended holiday, which afforded me some time to reflect on my future and switch off. And on a whim, over a beer with some friends, I gave myself a deadline: to incorporate something before the end of the year. I've spent 3 years working on carbon removal. I've spent 3 years commentating on it through the podcast. I've spent a year and a half working at a marketplace, selling and shifting carbon credits. Not at one of those points have I got my boots dirty. I actually made the thing that we all are clamoring for. Like, I want to do the thing. I want to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. I want to do it myself. I didn't necessarily see this as a full-time project, but more as a way of just having a go, getting my boots dirty, getting practical, hands-on experience in removing CO2. I told a few people what I was planning and made a few calls, but it wasn't much more than a pipe dream, filled with greenhouse gases. Then, a few months later, I got some bad news. I was made redundant Monday of the week just gone. So that is Monday the 13th. Yeah, well, lucky number 13. As you can probably tell, I was pretty down. And like any other person that's been in this situation, I went into panic mode. I started applying for jobs, working my network, booking coffees, scrolling through LinkedIn jobs boards. As the dust settled, however, a week or so later, my mind went back to the Biochar project. Had I been handed an opportunity here?
I'm currently sat in my car, brisk, cold November morning with a hot chocolate in my hands and a phone on the dashboard recording this. So it may never reach your ears, whoever is listening. But if it does, it means that I have begun a journey and have stuck at it and hopefully doing something meaningful in the carbon removal world through literally removing CO2 from the atmosphere. That's my plan. Don't know why it's so difficult to talk about. Maybe it makes it more real. Or maybe it makes me think about the reality of now being redundant and having no job lined up for the foreseeable future, which in some ways is very scary, and I think hopefully in other ways I can find to be quite exciting.
But, and I'm sure this is the same for any wannabe entrepreneur, self-doubt naturally begins to creep in. I'm not your typical carbon removal founder. I haven't got an engineering background, nor do I have a PhD. The whole redundancy process also made me question my self-worth and value in the industry. I'd also always wanted to start a business, and had given it a crack once or twice, but without much luck. I actually have run a business before, relatively successfully, and I know I can step up and take on that level of ownership and responsibility, but I've never gone from 0 to 1. And in all honesty, I'm terrified of crossing that chasm. My dad, Matthew Praviti, the pragmatist that he is, had some words of advice.
It may take a lot longer than you think, and there's a lot of other moving parts. So I wouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. I mean, you've just come out of a job, and you need to continue to explore the other alternatives in your space, don't you?
Yeah. You don't sound very enthusiastic.
Well, I don't know anything about it, do I? Other than what you've told me. It sounds interesting, but it sounds like there's a lot of unknowns, time-wise, that it's going to take 3 times as long as you think, I suspect. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to be a killjoy, but that's a long, hard journey. All right, well, I think you need to give it a lot of thought.
So I'll be pitching you next week.
Yeah, fine. We'll probably pledge business for that.
Yeah. My dad's right. There are a lot of moving parts to a biochar business. And there was so much that I just had no idea about. What about permitting? Am I even allowed to put biochar into UK soils? Then there's the costs. It's a hardware-heavy business, so I'm going to need to buy a pyrolysis machine, and there aren't any that I can find on Amazon. I need to think about the different stakeholders that I'm going to need major buy-in from. Where am I going to get the biomass? Where will I spread the char? Where will I actually do this project? How is a project like this going to make money? What's the underlying business model, and does it stack up? And how long was this going to take? My redundancy package would last me 6 months with savings. Was that enough time to get clear on whether this is a goer? I needed a pep talk, and for me, there was no better person to turn to than my oldest friend, Alex, who also happens to help projects unlock climate finance.
Effectively, you've got time now, and you've got an opportunity to now to do something, and those jobs might still be there in 6 months, still be there in 6 months, and you know that. Go have the conversations and work as quickly as possible to work out whether a biochar business is a real opportunity today, and don't jump on the first thing just because it's a job, because I think that's an easy mindset right now.
Yeah, because that's what I would have probably done on the Monday of last week, the day I was made redundant. Yeah, I'd probably be
scrambling for a job. You don't need to scramble for a job, okay? It's a case of, do I want to take a job that puts me back where I was before, when this 6 months gives me an opportunity to do something a little bit different?
A little bit different. I've always liked a little bit different. But I realised that while I'd talked about biochar and other methods till the cows came home, I'd never actually visited a biochar project, let alone held biochar in my hand. I knew that if I was going to do this, I needed to see it to believe it. So Armed with words of encouragement and caution from Dad and Alex, I chose the different route and made the 6-hour drive to see a couple of farmers turn biochar producers on a farm in Wales. 6 hours, 2 chargers, and about 4 coffees later, I drove up a country lane on top of a hill, parking outside a big corrugated barn. There were a couple of men going about their business, ignoring me mainly, and I thought for a second that I might have got the destination wrong. But then a friendly face came up the hill and introduced himself as Darren Jones, the man I'd been emailing back and forth about a visit to his family's farm.
Yeah, so the history of the family farm, Mum and Dad basically inherited it in the late 70s when they got married.
The dad here is Mick, who we heard talking about clover at the top of the show. Darren grew up on his parents' farm, and so he's seen its evolution over the decades.
They went into timber to try and make a bit of spare money, so started off doing gate posts and so on, local felling. And that grew into the sort of 90s where the timber biz was one of the largest oak businesses in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And then in about 2012, I think, we had a fire and lost one of our main part of our manufacturing process. But at that point, we were already working on biomass boilers.
Like many farmers, the Joneses had a lot of spare biomass floating around. But instead of just seeing it as waste, they turned to biomass boilers to generate heat and energy for the farm. They even developed this into a whole side of their business. However, it turns out that they had the kit and know-how to do something else.
Almost by error, to be honest, we made biochar. We just didn't put the main combustion fan on, and we had a low oxygen burn and developed biochar. And it was quite good biochar. Okay. So we thought we knew about biochar because I think Countryfile years ago we were watching about ash dieback. Because we're from a timber background, if you look around here, you can almost see a corridor of trees around the whole business. Because we've been planting trees for years, long before grants and carbon credits, etc. We've got about 4,500 trees we planted, mostly ash, so we were instantly interested. But back then they were looking at biochar at over £2,000, injecting it into the roots with air, and so that was like too expensive.
Okay.
So we knew about it, and then when we realised we can make it, that was my father. He looked at it and we all thought he was crazy, to be honest, because he's going on this big idea. And we made such a good biochar back since then. We started to look at making it, and then we really opened up to this. The market was about to go out it was, and how the benefits of biochar. And of course, once you start reading into it, it's unbelievable, isn't it? So we started making biochar. I think we were the second company in the UK to make biochar and trade the carbon credits.
Okay.
Then we started just over 3 years ago. We applied it onto the farm, and that's had 3 years of biochar treatment now. We've just been blown away by the results.
The Joneses are testament to the many pivots that farmers often have to make, and the innovations that come from those pivots. Having an open mindset in farming is tough, especially with a changing climate, changing subsidies regime, and consistently tight margins. But hey, nothing worth it in life comes without risk.
I can show you the R&D plant, which is true.
Okay.
It's a Frankenstein machine.
Okay.
Because we've built it over the years. My father calls it Betty. Even though it does not the prettiest look at it, it's a great machine. But we've got one being built now, which is going out to Sweden in December. So you'd actually see what the customer project model looks like. Yeah, but it's the same mechanism anyway.
Cool. Yeah, let's check it out. The machine I was about to see, Betty, was really the Joneses' prototype. Using their experience building machinery such as wood chip dryers and biomass boilers, they had now engineered a commercial model that they can sell to other would-be biochar producers.
So you've got the fuel is fed straight for the middle up the centre, and that comes out almost like a mushroom. So it just comes over, agitates out, and then agitates it outwards, and the biochar process comes down, and then it agitates off the end and goes into the water bath. And we've got an air.
Oh wow! So there's literally a water bath right under there. Then
that's right.
Pops straight in.
And it comes out for these conveyors, scraper chain conveyors.
Seeing Betty made everything real. You can make biochar in the UK, and you can do it at an initial small scale on farm. Chatting to Darren, walking through fields with Mick, hearing their journey. Mick's a farmer through and through, who heard about biochar on a wildlife documentary, thought it was a cool idea, and decided to make some. And now he's seeing the benefits on his farm.
Oh, well, there's beetroot. Sorry, grows relatively good beetroot as well.
That's an absolutely massive beetroot.
too big.
Jesus Christ. I've never seen a beetroot that big in my life.
So we literally ploughed a patch of this field last spring. I put another 3 buckets of base mix on, which is the biochar and green manure.
And you produced that. I've never seen a beetroot that big in my life.
Parsnips and carrots were like that. Everything was absolutely full on.
And that's organic. There's no nothing.
Absolutely fully organic.
My goodness.
So this is why I feel carbon capture with biochar has so many more benefits than just the carbon capture.
In the car home, it was like I'd seen a different future. I am driving back from Wales, where I spent most of the afternoon. But yeah, it was a really, really interesting experience. It was a family-run business, and maybe that's part and parcel of kind of setting up a biochar project. But it was really heartwarming to go to visit it. Betty is a very ugly-looking machine, but Betty works, and Betty's getting the job done. It's given me pause for reflection on the challenge, because this is not a small operation. By all means, it's a family-run business, but they've got a big couple of barns which is taking up. They have a whole workshop, which is again a massive barn with different workers building things and welding stuff. But at its core, it's a 100-acre farm run by a dad and his 3 kids. I hadn't just got enthusiasm for biochar. I now believe projects on farm were a great starting point. For one, farms have an abundance of biomass. Secondly, farmers are likely going to want the biochar. And thirdly, it sounded like something that could actually work on the ground. And dare I say it, something I could do? But as well as giving me the confidence to embark on my own biochar journey, I was beginning to realise that I wanted to make something else. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been thinking, what I'd love is have a playbook or some sort of script or step-by-step guide for setting up let's say a biochar project or a carbon removal project in general. And I don't know where that is. I don't know if anybody else knows where you can find one. So that's what I'm going to do. And as you're listening to this right now, it looks like I saw that through at least. So Mick and Darren were proof that this was possible. I was bought in. My questions now were, why isn't this happening more in the UK? Why aren't there more Mick and Darrens? And where was I going to do this? Next time, all those questions I had, we start trying to answer them. Screw it, let's do it. You've been listening to Grounded, a climate startup journey, a podcast from Restored. Thanks to everyone who chatted to me on this journey, whether recorded or not. And shout out to the team behind the show. Our producer and my creative partner in crime, Ben Weaver-Hinks. Our graphic designer, Lyubov Pankiv. Paola Science and Jack Turnham for all their work on helping market and promote the podcast. And a special thanks to the Future Leaders Network, an initiative of CORE, for supporting this podcast. If I could ask you to do just 2 favours, please hit that follow button wherever you're listening and give us a rating, because it really helps. And share this episode with a friend or a colleague who you think might like what we're doing. You can find us on restord.earth. That's restored without the second E, .earth.